Oh, welcome to today's episode of Free to Lead, Journeys of Leaders, driven by passion, inspired by purpose. I'm very excited today. We have a really futuristic entrepreneur, Dr. Gemma Green, and she's an entrepreneur, investor, and executive chairman of a company called Power Ledger, which develops software to trace and track every kilowatt of energy, using it for fast and efficient on their fast and efficient blockchain platform. She's passionate about blockchain technology, and she wants to democratize the power sector, enable greener and a more resilient energy system. And she's a renewable energy fintech expert. She's led Power Ledger to win the Sir Richard Branson Extreme Tech Challenge. She's become Fintech Entrepreneur of the Year. She's partnered with utilities and energy companies across the world. And she's also co-authored a best-selling book with Chris Voss called Empathy and Understanding in Business. She serves on various boards and committees, and she's interested in advanced sustainability, social responsibility in finance, urban development, and climate innovation. So let's unwind all of that and say hi to Gemma. Gemma, hi, welcome to the show.
G'day, Will. Thanks for having me.
Lovely Australian accent, although you're in Switzerland today.
Yes, I should be saying Grüezi because I'm in the German part of Switzerland.
Great. All right, Gemma, why don't you just give people a backstory? Because you didn't start out as someone in blockchain. You started out, in my history of you and I worked together a couple of years ago. I coached you for a year, and you were in Australia in blockchain, but that's not where you started. You started out in finance. So why don't you just give us a little backstory and how you ended up in blockchain in the leading edge of green energy?
I ended up in blockchain, I would say accidentally in a word, but I started out my career in investment banking, actually in London where you are. And I worked in banking for 11 years. The first part of my career was in mainstream finance, and then partway through, the bank that I was working at set up an environmental and social risk management unit to look at the bank's financing activities and underwriting activities, which is like listing companies on stock exchanges from an environmental perspective. So I was working with mining companies, oil and gas companies, heavy manufacturing, and helping them get ready for listing on a stock exchange by preparing their listing disclosure documents and professionalizing their management team to the kind of expectations of international investors who expected international environmental health and safety and social standards. And in 2012, I decided to take a sabbatical from banking, and I took a 9-month break, did a lot of hiking in various different countries. And on the longest hike that I did, which was the Camino de Santiago, I got this idea to build an eco village, which I thought was a bit of a crazy idea at the time, but I eventually shared it with a few friends, and they suggested I should reach out to a professor from Curtin University in Perth in Western Australia, where I'm from. Reached out to him and shared this idea, and he thought it was a great idea, copied in the mayor of Fremantle. And by the time I arrived back in Australia after 9 months of backpacking, I had coffee with the mayor set up, and Peter Newman and I discussed doing this as a research project for my PhD, which is what I ended up doing. Halfway through my doctorate, I had a baby, my first child, and I also got an email from a former JP Morgan colleague of mine who introduced me to a guy called John Bullich, and he wanted some introductions to people in my network. And as I just had a baby, I called up my mum and said, "Mum, could you come over and hold baby Amelie, who was like 7 weeks old at the time?" And so the four of us sat in my living room, and John started to tell me about blockchain. And this was February 2016, so 8.5 years ago. And I'd really only heard of blockchain in terms of Bitcoin at that stage and emotionally. And nowadays, everyone knows quite a lot about blockchain, I would say. But at that time, it was very novel. And he was telling me all of the applications blockchain had for different use cases and sectors. And I said, what about electricity? Because at that point, I was actually quite stuck in my PhD. I'd designed this solar and battery system for an eco village, And I had wanted software that would allow the trading of electricity within the eco village, and I couldn't find anything that did that. And that started John and I looking together, and we saw quite a lot of opportunities, not just in solving this challenge that I had in my doctoral research, but also for trading electricity across the grid, tracking electricity down to each kilowatt hour in terms of the type, time, place, and then also tokenization of carbon credits and other energy attribute certificates. So we saw a lot and we got very excited. And 3 months later, we set up the company. So we set up the company in May, of 2016.
Yeah.
And yeah, with the mission for the democratization of power for a sustainable future. And that is what we've been working on since.
Yes, I have some understanding that, and many listeners listening in might not. My layman's understanding of that is, as an example, people with solar panels can generate their own electricity. They can also sell it back to the energy providers at a
Yes.
certain fee. And with your technology, I understand they can also sell it to their neighbors, and they can buy it
Yes.
from you cheaper than they can buy it from the energy companies, etc. So it's quite a deal that you're setting up there. And can you say a little bit about that in more layman terms? And because
Yeah.
it allows you to track where all the electricity came from, so it allows for that sort of distribution.
Yeah, pretty much for a century, electricity was one directional. Big power stations outside cities, like coal-fired power, gas-fired power, nuclear power, sending electricity one way to people's homes and businesses. And about 30 years ago, that began to change. A lot of it was stimulated by what's called a feed-in tariff, which is like an economic rebate, like a subsidy for people installing rooftop solar on their roofs, and then whatever they don't consume and they export to the grid, they get a certain amount of money guaranteed. And that is the feed-in tariff. And the amount of money people were getting was like huge. And that was really to offset the very high cost of the solar panels. And as they became cheaper, the feed-in tariff got smaller, but it was still very attractive. And it became a victim of its own success. And so we ended up with like lots of solar in all the places where the feed-in tariff stimulus was provided. But it's a pretty blunt price signal. It basically just says, put this thing on, doesn't matter whether there's even anyone to consume it on the other side, we'll give you some money. And actually it caused oversupply of energy in many parts of the grid. And what that means is you actually get congestion in the same way you do on a road. And congestion is really bad for the grid. If you've got a lot of electricity that's pushing up against a substation, you're going to have to upgrade that substation. Otherwise, the life of it will be impacted pretty dramatically. And these are like multi-million pound pieces of infrastructure. So if you've got congestion, you've got to solve it some way. And so the feed-in tariff actually overstimulated the generation of electricity in new parts of the grid that never actually had generation assets at all. It was really on the outskirts, brought in through transmission lines to distribution. So all of a sudden, you had to upgrade the grid everywhere to deal with this, or even curtail the electricity and prevent it from being exported. And so it's become a victim of its own success. And the idea of Power Ledger was really to look at how can we create a local energy market that encourages the growth of renewables without subsidy, but only the amount of energy that is actually needed in a particular part of the grid, and don't encourage beyond that. And peer-to-peer trading is a concept which is like a nice thing for households.
Peer-to-peer. Wait, just because you talk quite quickly for my English ears, right? So peer-to-peer trading.
Peer-to-peer trading. So you and I say we live on the same street. You have solar, I don't have solar. You can sell your electricity back to your provider, as you said before, but you could also sell it to me, because I live in a rental property. I can't put rooftop solar in, but I want renewable energy. And I love the idea of buying it from you rather than buying it from somewhere else.
It's also cheaper for that neighbor to buy it from me, and I also get a better price than if I sold it back to the energy company. Is that right?
It can be. It will be no worse, and it will at least the same or better, I think, is the most accurate way to describe it. And once you start adding in batteries, then it's even better. Because if you say, I've got a battery, but I don't have solar, I can store your surplus solar in my battery, and then
Mm.
you can buy it back off me at night. And you'll pay more for that because electricity at night is more expensive. And so I'll pay back the investment in my battery much faster. So say instead of 11 years to pay it off, I might pay it off in 6.
Mm.
And so the fact that we can peer-to-peer trade electricity encourages me to put in a battery, put in a bigger battery, and actually you get cheaper electricity, and we support the grid as well, because all of that solar is not being exported to the substation causing congestion. So it's
Mm.
a service to the network, plus it actually delivers lower cost electricity as well.
Yeah, great. And all of that's recorded. So you know which piece of electricity is moving backwards and forwards and who's got it and who's got it from who. And because that's the blockchain that allows for that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Electricity, once you put electricity in the grid, it's fungible. And what I mean by that is that you can't distinguish one electron for another, 1 kWh for another, but there is an accounting system. And what it does, the way the accounting system works is you measure with smart meters how much electricity has been exported or imported,
Yes.
and at what type of electricity as well. And then there's another accounting system that sits on top of it beyond the volume of electricity. It records the type sometimes with what's called an attribute certificate or a renewable energy certificate. And what that says is you've generated 1 MWh of renewable electricity. That's one renewable energy certificate. And you can actually sell that as well. It's a bit complicated, but I mention it because you can't necessarily tag an electron, but there is like a very good system to do it. But what the blockchain provides is a rock solid audit trail. Because the more of this stuff, like energy, when it used to be one directional from coal, gas, or nuclear, you didn't really need to distinguish that because no one was making claims that it was renewable. But now differentiating types of energy because of the greenness actually is a marketing tool. And
Yeah.
so regulators are starting to really on people making false claims. And false claims typically are called greenwash, where you go, that I'm selling renewable energy, but you're not.
Mm.
And so how do you need a good system to track all of that? And I think blockchain actually can measure granularly type, time, place, so that you can more legally, you can have confidence around the claims that you're making around types of energy, which I
Yeah.
think is quite important. And there are now many companies that are actually being sued for making false claims. So it's becoming like a ever more important topic, I would say.
Yeah. And as a household, I remember this conversation with you as a householder, I could say, I only want electricity from the wind farm and you
Yes.
know, that solar plant over there. I don't want anything from coal fired or nuclear, or you can actually, with your software, is that right?
Yes.
You can actually,
Allocate the output of a particular generation asset to you and not oversell that allocation from that like solar farm to anyone else.
yeah,
Yes. So it's like a mini power purchase agreement between you and the generator.
yes,
And I think these are new ways of actually like transacting energy, new commercial models, new business models. And they're really about putting citizens at the heart of the energy system, rightly so.
yeah,
And helping them to have more control over their energy future. At the same time, supporting the grid without subsidy. Because I think renewables can often be maligned rightly because it pushes up electricity prices, but that's the subsidy model. We see our software as like a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle to be able to allow more renewables into the grid without subsidy.
yeah, yeah. So clear for anybody listening that you are driven by your passion for all of this, right? Now, my question would be, okay, what's the purpose of it? What's the like the vision, the future that's fueling that? Because for me, passion and purpose are connected. If we can connect those two things, we can keep you because it's easy to be inspired for a while, or it's easy to be
Yeah.
motivated for a while, but if you've got a larger purpose that you're up to, it's probably obvious, but I want to hear it from how you see it. What
Well,
is the purpose that's fueling this real passion?
when we set up the company, you have to prove firstly you can build anything. Proving we could do this was like what clients, utilities we basically make software for utilities so they can make these products for their customers. So they're predominantly our client. And you're a startup and they don't believe that you can really do anything. So firstly, you got to prove your capability. So in our case, we did that in Japan, in New Zealand, in Australia, Thailand. But when you get to Europe, they don't really care that you've done something in Japan. They want to know, can you do it in Europe?
Yes.
And so we ended up proving out that in India, other places. And then we had lots of lighthouse projects that really just demonstrated global capability. And within the utilities, there was usually like somebody that was really like pioneering that product and that project. And then as you get along, you start to understand how much of the whole organization is up for this, or how big a market, given the dynamics where they are, how big a market is there for us? And actually, we moved the company from Australia to Switzerland a little over a year ago. And we did that because we found that the clients that were most pioneering and able to scale were in Europe.
Yeah.
So we decided to relocate the head office of the company from Australia to Switzerland. And at the same time, we were in 14 countries at this stage. And when we looked at all of them in terms of the addressable market and the obtainable market, there were really like 4 places that actually really ticked all the boxes. And so we actually started to wind down our other projects and just focus on those places. And I think that was quite important, I think, to maintain the enthusiasm as well, because I didn't want to just be doing more and more like projects that got to a certain level of scale, but actually had a ceiling. I wanted to really look at how far I could push it. And so that meant, instead of being broad, starting to go deep. And I'd say the place where we're making the most progress is in Austria, with a really innovative energy supplier there called Energy Steiermark. And I would call it, they're pioneers, but what makes them really unique is that they put consumers at the center of their product. Like, they are really consumer focused and want to give consumers what they want. And I think that is very exciting for me personally, to be working with a retailer like that. And now we're in commercial scale up phase. They're both targeting households and businesses to get more users on the platform. And I think that at scale, that will show the model and how it can work and what that provides, both at the retailer level to attract new customers and retain them, but also with the energy communities in terms of what that provides for them as well. And I think that is very motivating for me.
Yeah, brilliant. I was just thinking as you were talking, because I'm always creating as I'm listening to someone, is it already implicit, but is there any application for people who might be listening who are interested in reducing their carbon footprint? Is there an application of what you're doing, or would that be a whole new thing to create?
Yeah, so we're actually working on that right now, which is like with a website that sells a lot of experiences like hotels, flights, concert tickets, the ability to offset and buy carbon credits from us. Because I think that this is something that I wouldn't say even like a huge amount of consumers want to, but there's a good amount that would like to. And it's actually quite difficult for them to calculate and figure it out and do it all. And so we're looking at where would be an interesting place to start to allow the consumer end to do that in a very transparent, easy way. So I think that, I think there's a segment of consumers for which that will be an appealing product. It's not for everybody. I'd say it's probably like 10, 20% of the market, actually.
Very good. Because I didn't attend this conference, but I was invited to attend a conference in the Middle East. And the big subject of the whole thing was reducing carbon down to zero. Have you put stakes out in that, or is it?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk around this concept called net zero. And I actually think it's quite fraught and problematic. And you can start to see the commitments creaking. It's understanding actually what that entails.
Yes.
And that most prominently in the cloud service providers like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, that had previously made commitments around that. But as their businesses have grown quite meteorically in the recent years because of AI, which is extraordinarily energy hungry, they've realized that the cost of actually doing that is prohibitively expensive And so they've been walking back from their commitments in various different ways. And I think that, I think net zero is, got a lot of issues. I don't think it's necessarily a good system at all. Yeah, I think, and it's not just for AI and cloud service providers. We've seen this with other companies, for example, EasyJet, Gucci, Nestle have all recently made announcements or put a few lines in their annual report that they're no longer able to do that. And I think the amount of the idea that we're going through what people will call an energy transition, I think is actually a complete misnomer. We are actually in a state of energy expansion, unnecessarily so, in my view. Of course, you can use energy more efficiently, but energy lifts people out of poverty. And there are no countries in the world that have low energy consumption and high standard of living. It doesn't exist. And there's still 700 million people living in poverty. And a lot of people in the renewable energy space would say we're in energy transition, and it's just completely wrong. Actually, we're using more energy than ever before every single year. And renewables isn't replacing any of the existing sources of energy. It's just being added to it. And rightly so. And it's not just a new phenomena with renewables. If you go back to coal and gas and nuclear, what I was saying was that we're in a state of energy expansion, and energy is something that lifts people out of poverty. And there's an uncomfortable conversation. Like before we started the podcast, we were talking about confronting things. And I think there's really something to confront in the context of energy, which is this reality. And the idea that we would just stop oil is really fanciful and very naive. And I don't agree with a lot of the things that I see happening within the renewable space or the climate space at all, around damaging people's property or throwing paint at old paintings, masterpieces. I think that these kinds of actions are incredibly bad behavior, but also incredibly naive and oversimplification. And you can see this most pronounced in the countries that have got energy policy so wrong. For example, South Africa, where there's rolling brownouts and blackouts, load shedding. And if you ask anyone there what they think about that, they do not want that. That makes running a business extremely problematic, living your life extremely problematic. So they've had it, and they've had it taken away, and it's not good. And then in countries that have mismanaged their energy policy, not to that extent, but still not properly put, like the feed-in tariff, I think, is an example of this. In all the countries that have very high amounts of variable renewable energy, so solar and wind, it generates electricity variably depending on when the sun's shining or when the wind's blowing, compared to coal, gas, and nuclear, which is what you would call dispatchable electricity. You can turn it on when you want. Variable renewable energy was stimulated by these feed-in tariffs. And I mentioned at the beginning about upgrading substations. That's actually hugely costly. So if you look at all the countries that have a lot of variable renewable energy, they also have the highest electricity costs in the world. And actually, the worst right now is the UK. The UK has the highest electricity costs in the world. Wow. And it just got the helm with this title recently of Germany. Germany has mismanaged its energy policy, driven by a lot of political ideology and not really thinking about, if we stop something, when we stop one type of energy, have we got enough of another type to actually still maintain everything as it needs to be without pushing up prices?
Increasing demand as well. That's even worse.
Correct. Yes. And I think that's you can see that it's a failure of renewable energy policy, and it's why many people are against renewable energy. They're against high electricity prices because they don't want people to have to choose between heating and eating. And I agree. And they don't want businesses to be offshored to lower cost jurisdictions where people lose their jobs and livelihoods. And I agree with that too. So I think there's an uncomfortable reality that needs to be faced, which is really a dose of realism and actually understanding what is happening in energy, not just platitudes.
Yes. Wow. Awesome. Very educational for people who want to hear about what's actually happening, because I did hear that whole They had that whole conference with energy, and then it's kind of gone quiet, like you said. So it's understandable. Back to your journey. I always ask this question: what are some of the challenges or failures that happened to you along the way that you really learned from? Do you have any of those?
So many.
I
Uh,
know you do. I coached you for a year, so I know some of them, but we'll see what
yeah.
stands out for you.
Oh, there's so many. I think the most recent one was actually reshaping my life in deciding to leave Australia. Then I had to decide with my business partner, where are we going to move the company and am I going to live? And
Yes.
I've got 3 kids now. Emily is now 8. I've got a 6-year-old son, Castiel, and a 4-year-old son,
Yeah.
Alfie,
Yeah.
and my husband and a dog.
Yeah.
And yeah, like moving everyone, it's not a small undertaking. And choosing, like, we've ended up in a place called Zug, which is actually a very rural place, but it's also called Crypto Valley. And there's a lot of blockchain companies here. And that's been really invigorating because although it's a very rural setting, so I live in a village now with 3,000 people, and
Yeah.
my children walk to school every day. It's lovely.
Mm.
It's actually very intellectually stimulating to be amongst the blockchain community and in close proximity to lots of things happening. So it's quite an exciting place, although it's
Yeah.
quite. And I think the other thing which I mentioned to you earlier was around changing the strategy of the company in this sort of scale up phase, and really evaluating what really should we start, stop, and keep,
Yeah.
and making some quite difficult decisions around that. And then what happened in actually clearing that space was John and I started to think about, also because we were meeting so many other entrepreneurs here, investing in other companies. And so
Mm.
we've started to do that as well.
Yes.
And because we're entrepreneurs ourselves, we understand what it's like, and we want to be able to support really great projects. So I think that's another aspect of something more recently that that, like, moving countries jolts you out of your kind of, my friend Carrie Granger used the term tranquilized oblivion. And yeah, and I think that's what happened here. I should mention, it would be remiss of me not to mention another product that we have, which is TraceX, which is a marketplace for trading the renewable energy certificates. And
Mm.
we have that in the US, and we've got a CEO, Fiona Tiller, who leads that business. And it's really around making it super transparent and quick to be able to
Yeah.
buy and sell REX, which is normally super complicated, costly, and very opaque in terms of knowing what the prices are. So that's
Yeah.
another platform that we've developed, and we're really focused on the US market for that.
Brilliant. And if I can bring it right down to basics. So here you are, this entrepreneur in the high tech world with 3 children and marriage, and then relocating to another part of the world. I can't imagine there hasn't been breakdowns and challenges with that. And as a female entrepreneur with all of that, there must be, I'm sure, people listening who are like facing those kind of challenges, or whatever challenge you can say that you've had to navigate. Any gold nuggets from all of that? Because I know that was challenging for you.
Notice, because I was so excited about moving, I
Mm.
actually had so much energy to do all the 1,000 things that it takes to move. And
Yes.
even on the other side, the 1,000 things it takes to set up a life, because we didn't actually bring a lot of our stuff. We left a lot of it in Australia. So we had to
Yeah.
reconstitute a life here in terms of just basic things like a garlic crusher, and then also figure out how to do things in a country where English is not the dominant language here to do everyday things, and us, the system is completely different. I lived in the UK for 11 years, and it still took me, even though you've obviously got the common language, culturally, it took me a long time to understand British culture. And for example, when people would say things like, it's quite good, it took me a long time to realize what they meant was that's really SHIT. And also, British people, like, lovely, and they're also understandably quite reserved, especially in London with foreigners, because they're coming and going all the time. And it took me a long time to make British friends. But when I did, and they're still my dearest friends now. Like, I've got a WhatsApp group with they're called London Ladies, and we actually, we all stay abreast of what's going on in each other's lives. And I would say Switzerland's a little bit similar. Like, the Swiss are super kind and lovely, and they're more, what do I call it, more reserved. But I think that they are really responsive to you making an effort. My children, I put them in the local school, so they're learning in German and Swiss German. And I've joined the local women's group, and we celebrate all of the Swiss activities like in the village, which are, it's really like wonderful. So many community things to do here. And yeah, you can see how people are like very wanting you to have a good experience in their country as well. So I think really investing in that and making the most of being here instead of just like living an expat life and putting my kids in like an international school and just hanging out with expats exclusively. So I think that's been something that like I'm just fascinated by the Swiss culture and how they've kept it intact so wonderfully, particularly in the German bit with their language. The language actually has the culture stay intact. And so to be a part of the culture, you really need the language as well. So it's a bit of a labor of love and battle for me to get better at the language as well so that I can fit in here more.
Just an unexhaustible amount of energy. It just exudes from you. It's just been great. And we could keep going, but we have to curtail it. People reach you because I'm sure they could be other, not just female, but female entrepreneurs would like maybe want to reach out to you and say, hey, what do you think about this? Or obviously with your blockchain, and I can imagine investors listening to this thinking, whoa, I should jump on this. And how did people?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, or X, Telegram. People can reach out to me. I think one thing I would say is when I had, for women, when I had my kids and my first one, a lot of people were like, how are you going to do all this if you have a kid that I was doing? And it definitely changes in terms of what you can do or how you go about doing it. But I also think that it's just a belief. Like the people that give up a lot or make that trade actually do that because they think that's what they have to do, or they've got no choice, or that's just the way it is. And I've just realized that the way it is just the way you say it is. And I'd say that just not just about having kids. Like I have friends that would go to a barbecue and they'd be like, I've got to go home at 7:30 now because we've got to put our kids to bed. And they abdicated from their lives to a great extent. Whereas others were like, fling the kids over their shoulder, put them on a couch and like continued, or even went traveling with kids. And I just think, I think that I just feel like that you can find a way to make it work with the will to do it. And there's a real richness to life in adopting that kind of policy. And I think with the business as well, we've been pioneering things, and it does require a lot of energy. And I think once you have kids, you've got to look at a bit more, how do you dish that out in a very discerning way? So having kids for me was really about being more discerning about what I spend my time on, and also thinking about like the business. You've got to step out of it to actually be able to look in it properly and make some new decisions. I'd say that finding moments to do that, I think, is really helpful. Even if it's at a conference where you're speaking with your business partner or senior people, just being out of that environment, new environments, I think, stimulate new ideas. And I am a big fan of that. Beautiful.
Great. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's been amazing and great to catch up.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you.